Good morning, Derek. It's really great to have you here today.
Very good to be here. Thank you so much.
So, Derek, there is a real consensus brewing among policymakers in New York that building a more equitable city has got to be one of New York's one or two defining policy priorities. But there's not yet clarity on what policies will be most important to get us there. As someone who's delved into some of the biggest economic issues facing our country, I'm curious what you think a city government like New York can do to lay the groundwork for a more equitable economy, or more generally, what specific challenges city leaders will need to tackle.
Well, I like to think about this problem from the perspective of citizens, of people that live in cities. And the ones that I spend a lot of time thinking about are young adults, people that are just starting families. It occurred to me a few years ago that cities like New York, like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, were facing a depopulation problem when it came to young families. And if you looked at the share of young families who lived in these cities, or more specifically, if you looked at the number of babies that were being born in America's richest, densest cities, it seemed to be going down, down, down. In fact, I have data right here that I'm looking at. In 2001, Los Angeles County, which this is not the exact same as New York, obviously, but it's the same trends are happening across the country. In 2001, Los Angeles County recorded 153,000 live births. In 2021, it recorded fewer than 100,000 live births. So that is a 33% decline in babies in Los Angeles County in 21 years. You extrapolate that out, and you're looking at cities that are reasonably sort of childless. They're kind of like playgrounds for the rich and mostly childless. And this is concerning to me because I think that in order to have a really wonderful and well-functioning city that is good for everyone, it has to be good for young families. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, how do we build an equitable city, a wonderful city for young families to raise their children in? That seems to be a really big challenge.
Absolutely. And we've also seen research here that shows that it's a lot of not just middle class, but also working poor New Yorkers that have been moving to places like Charlotte, to the Atlanta area, to suburban Philadelphia. And we want to keep those New Yorkers and have them, kind of grow and prosper in New York. Well, let me ask a related thing, and that's first, what can New York or any city do to kind of arrest that decline, to kind of be a better place for families of all types, of all backgrounds to stay in the city and raise their families here?
I think it's worthwhile to be focused on two things. There's a lot of things you can focus on, but I'm just going to focus on two things for the purpose of answering this question: houses and school. Houses and school. Lots of families, lower class, middle class, upper class, move where housing is affordable and move to where schools are good. So if you can have a situation where you're building more housing and you have higher quality schools, that's really great for being able to keep these younger families. But that doesn't seem to be happening right now. The average rent in Manhattan just hit $5,000 for the first time ever. Rents are accelerating across the 5 boroughs, as I understand it. And this is cashing out, as you just said, a lot of lower income, middle class, but even upper class families that are leaving New York. And it's having an effect on school districts as well. In New York City, K-12 enrollment in public schools has dropped about 10% since COVID. To a certain extent, that is about families sometimes, pulling their kids out of school because, they don't like the remote policy, or they think that they want to do a sort of homeschooling situation. It's a little bit of that, but mostly it's about demographics. Mostly it's about the fact that cities, as they become more expensive, as housing becomes more expensive, and as there becomes an impression that the schools aren't top notch in order to justify those high housing costs, they simply say, we're going to move to the suburbs instead. And that, I think, empties out the city from something that it really needs in order to be a boisterous, wonderful, equitable place for lots of different people and lots of different families.
Do you think there's any risk that New York, or maybe some of the other dense cities that you write about, are at risk of kind of losing the status as like places of aspiration? And I ask because this event that we're having today is called City of Aspiration. And I think that, there's some questions whether cities in general, or New York specifically, are places where folks that come up from lower income backgrounds and lower income communities are able to elevate into the middle class. And I wonder if you feel like that's at risk today, and also what are some of the strategies that government can take either in cities like New York or nationally to change that and to make places more cities of aspiration again?
Well, when you say aspiration, I think it's actually really interesting because I think different groups have different aspirations and individuals across their lives have different aspirations. So first, someone who graduates from, let's say, Harvard or some top university is going to have slightly different aspirations than someone who, say, emigrates from the Dominican Republic. But you want, I think, a city to be a vessel for fulfilling both of their aspirations, that it produces lots of jobs and lots of affordable housing and lots of beautiful and rich communities so that they can both move to the larger New York City area. But it's also the case, just to beat the same drum again, it's also the case that people have different aspirations across their lives, that when someone moves to New York City as a 22-year-old after they graduate from, say, some four-year university at a public school, at a public university, they move to New York City, they have certain aspirations for their first few years in New York, right? Between, say, 22 and 26. Maybe they just want to have fun. They want wonderful bars. They want safety on the streets. They can, stay out until 2 a.m. They want relatively affordable apartments. They can afford to stay in the city, even as their incomes hopefully are going up in their first 4 years. They have those aspirations. But then in their late 20s, early 30s, those same people who've now moved to New York City might meet someone in New York City and they want to settle down. They want to get married, start a family. And then their aspirations change a little bit. They need a bigger space in order for their larger family. So they need affordable apartments at that level, at that number of bedrooms. But they're also starting to look at, okay, where are the good schools? And so their aspirations are changing. And so I think it's really difficult, but also very important for cities to match the aspirations of all the various people they want to attract. And so, there's lots of solutions you can talk about, but one solution here, I just think it's very, very important to focus on housing supply, because housing supply affects housing inventory, and housing inventory is probably the single most important fact when it comes to housing prices. So I think that to a certain extent, it all begins with housing policy. And I think that if you want to continue to attract more and more people to your city, you have to be laser focused on housing policy and housing supply.
Absolutely. We have a report coming out that has a bunch of ideas for tackling some of the issues because New York has not been building enough housing, or at least enough to keep pace with the growing population over the past decade or two. Let me ask you, between your reporting for The Atlantic and your excellent podcast, you get to speak to so many thoughtful economists and economic researchers. And I'm curious if there are one or two policies for advancing economic mobility or expanding economic opportunity that you found particularly interesting or promising. It doesn't have to be policies that have already been implemented at a city level or in New York, but just things that you have heard about or you thought were particularly promising that maybe could be tried at a city level. Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that come to mind, like, for example, Raj Chetty, who's done lots of work. He's at Harvard University. He's done lots of work on economic mobility across the country. He's looked at the differences in different neighborhoods in terms of their likelihood of elevating the lower middle class into the middle and upper middle class, right? That kind of like social mobility. How do we make the American dream alive across the country? And one of his key findings is that it really matters what neighborhood you grow up in. There's a huge difference between growing up in some places in the Southeast versus growing up in some places in the Midwest, where social mobility is a lot higher. And there's lots of ingredients that determines whether or not a neighborhood is high social mobility. One of them is economic integration. Another of them is overcoming what he calls friendship bias, having sort of friendships between people in different economic strata. That seems to be really important for building social mobility. He's looked at this thing called father presence. Father presence means the share of fathers that live in your neighborhood. So it seems to matter, especially for low-income boys and especially low-income non-white boys, isn't just whether or not a father is in your household, but the share of households in your neighborhood that have fathers in them, so that you have access to more role models that can tell you, finish school, go to college, continue along this sort of success sequence that allows you to find a job and stay out of trouble. So there's all sorts of ways, all sorts of ingredients that he's found that are really, really important for, raising the likelihood that a neighborhood is going to have high social mobility. He's looked at this across the country, and it's just really interesting the degree to which even within New York City, there are some neighborhoods that have extraordinarily high social mobility and some neighborhoods that have really low social mobility. And the truth is that, again, sorry to come back to my bugaboo, a lot of it I think does come down to housing supply. We need to continue to grow the number of available households and available apartments near to where the jobs are, so that people don't necessarily have to commute from way, way out in order to have access to those jobs, but we build access to those jobs into the city. I think that's really, really important for creating economic integration, which is so important in Raj Chetty's work.
I mean, that seems absolutely critical. And I think one of the takeaways, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with what you mentioned about Chetty, is that if he's seen these things, or we understand that there are some factors that contribute to economic mobility in a neighborhood within New York City, can policymakers here in New York, for instance, figure out how can we create those conditions maybe in other neighborhoods?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, one of the things I think is so great about his work is that it allows us, or invites us, I should say, to study the neighborhoods where we see this legacy of positive social mobility, and then ask, okay, what is it about these neighborhoods that seems to be so special? Now, I don't have the perfect answer here. I'm not sure that Professor Chetty has it either, but he is starting to figure out what those ingredients are. Things like economic integration, things like friendships between classes, things like father presence. These seem to be really, really critical variables. Now, I don't necessarily think that there is a specific lever that local governments should pull in order to increase father presence, right? I don't think that we should necessarily, mandate that certain couples stay together or get married. That feels like a little Soviet, a little communist for my liking. But I think it's really important to study what are the variables that seem to be most important, and then how can we use the appropriate levers to make them more widespread. And again, I just think that housing policy is so important, and finding ways to create or bring people closer to good schools, that also seems really critical to me as well.
Last question. I mean, and this kind of gets to what you were saying before about jobs closer to where people live, but remote work has risen tremendously coming out of the pandemic. And I'm curious, do you see economic challenges here for New York, or particularly challenges that might exacerbate some of the inequalities that we already see in New York? And the last part of the question is are there things that the city can do, or a city can do, to get ahead of this, to mitigate some of those potentially negative consequences?
Well, it's clear that New York has remote work challenges. And that's in part because New York is a really expensive place to live, has for decades been a really expensive place to live. And if you have if you live in New York and you pay $4,000 for rent, and you have a company that says you can live anywhere, and you have lots of friends who live in a city where rent is, half the cost, 3/4 of the cost, then a lot of those people are probably going to move. But what we've seen, I think, in New York is that, yes, some people leave, but also some people arrive. New York has an extraordinary amount of churn. So I think that there are remote work challenges for a city like New York. A lot of people, I think, are going to leave. But New York, the culture of New York has always been, I think, one of reinvention and revitalization. And I'm not concerned for New York in the long run. New York's culture, its cultural amenities, it has certain things that no other city has, and it will continue to attract people in their 20s, continue to attract, I should say, a lot of single people in their 20s for years and years to come. What I want is for New York policymakers to focus on that next stage in the life cycle, not to just be the single best place in the country to come to if you're 25 and single, but to be the best place in the country to stay when you're 31 and just starting a family. I think that is the challenge that New York policy makers need to respond to.
All right, what a great point to end on. Derek, it's been so great having you today, and thanks so much, and keep up all the good work.
Thanks so much.